Hi, I'm Bob Doyle, the information philosopher, webcasting to you from my new ITV studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I wanted to look at this screen for just a moment before we get over to the topic of our lecture. Information philosophy is a new and radical view of the way to solve problems in philosophy, in physics, in biology, and in psychology especially, which will be the topic of our metaphysical presentation today. Information is not a conserved quantity like matter and energy. Instead, it's a growing quantity, a dynamic quantity that's been increasing since the beginning of the universe, as I've tried to show in earlier lectures. The total matter and energy in the universe is a conserved quantity. There's only exactly the same matter and energy in the universe as there was at its beginning, as hard as that is to believe. But information has been being created, and created is an important term because the universe itself has been created, as we'll be able to show, some 14 billion years ago. And since that time, many things have been created, even the atoms and molecules of matter, and the subatomic molecules, subatomic particles that turned into these atoms and so forth. We have a wonderful history of early cosmology and the story of the evolution of galaxies, stars, and planets. But living things, you and I on this planet, are dynamic and growing things, whereas the forces that control the material objects in the universe are in charge of everything those objects do. Our planet Earth goes around the sun according to the Newtonian laws of motion. But you and I are dynamic things, and I'm going to argue that we are not the material out of which we're made. We are instead forms. Pure information is in charge of our material. That means I'm saying that there's an abstract aspect to us, which is the information that's stored in our minds. And I want to say that we are a form through which matter is flowing in order to maintain ourselves, because the material of our body, the atoms and molecules, the cells in particular, are dying and having to be replenished very rapidly. Our red blood cells die, many of them in a matter of hours, and are replaced completely in a matter of days or weeks. The timing I should get more exactly next time. So I'm going to argue that the mind is pure abstract information, and I'm going to liken it to a kind of modern spirit, a kind of ghost in the machine, as some cognitive scientists criticized it. It's the mind in the body then, and it is pure information. Now, today's topic is concerns the idea of how it is that decisions are made in our mind. And you'll recall, or our brain, I think, the language of Benjamin Libet, the great neurologist who came up with this experiment, famous experiment, talked in terms of our brain. He did not talk in particular or differentiate the informational aspect as I do, but it will help us, I think, to make some progress in understanding his work. Now, I'm going to take a quick look. Sadly, let's see. Let's take this screen to full screen for us for a moment, and just notice how it is I came to be taking up this topic today. The experiments by Benjamin Libet seem to show there's brain activity a fraction of a second before we're consciously aware of having made a decision. And I'm going to try to show that basically what the mind is doing, or what the brain is doing, and what we're doing is thinking in that early time before we make a decision. We're thinking about the alternative possibilities for what we might do when the time comes to make the decision. Famously, the Libet experiments gave you no time to think. They were simply a question of deciding that you're going to flick a wrist and report the time when you're aware, consciously aware of flicking your wrist. Okay, so this topic today comes from one of our commenters or commentators who asked this question: how do I reconcile Benjamin Libet's EEG experiments, and bring that to full screen, the readiness potential, he called it, which detects a brain's motor cortex response 300 milliseconds prior to a person being consciously aware of that response. Let me make a switch to one more screen here for a moment, and that's this one. I can scroll down. You remember I have multiple screens that are capable of doing different things. And here what I'm able to do is to highlight his work. Here's the Benjamin Libet page, but I'm going to read to you that he performed a sequence of remarkable experiments in the early 1980s that were enthusiastically, if mistakenly, adopted by determinists and compatibilists to show that human free will does not exist. Okay? Let me take a look at one of the important books that made this argument. This is the work of the Harvard psychologist Dan Wegner, and Dan made this case that the conscious will is an illusion. We saw several other people a few days ago who are determinists and hard determinists, and that there's no opportunity for us to have freedom of the will. But I want to point out that Benjamin Libet, who's wrote several articles, but I'm very happy with this book that he wrote called Mind Time, in which he described a temporal factor in consciousness. Okay? I'm going to also look behind the work of Benjamin Libet to the work of Hans Kornhuber and Deecke, the Germans who did the original research on what's called the readiness potential and provided a wonderful reasoned appraisal of free will. So it may be good to take a look at his experiment, but let's go back to this for a moment and read a little bit more of what's on the Information Philosopher blog. Libet's measurements of that time before the subject is aware of self-initiated actions have had an enormous, and I say mostly negative, impact on the case for human free will. Despite, if you read Libet's book, you'll see that his view does nothing to deny human freedom. And since free will, in my model, the two-stage model of free will, is understood as a complex combination of two antagonistic concepts, a kind of freedom that's in the early thinking phase, coming up with new alternative possibilities, as William James called them, creative, new ideas coming into our mind, is an early part of a process which is best seen, as Libet talks, and Kornhuber and Deecke, as a temporal sequence. Something's happening in time. And they measured exactly what that time was in the really very artificial example of trying to find out when an agent becomes aware of having decided to flick a wrist. So let's see. I show here that there's a series of black lines, measurements of a kind of an EEG reading of the electric potential on the surface of the head as a function of time. And then there comes a time when the subject is aware of having decided to flick the wrist. Let me just give you a little detail of that. The wrist actually had a switch connected to it, basically an electrical switch, so that when you throw the wrist down, the switch would fire, and the experiment would then have been recording this potential. And what Kornhuber and Deecke did was to save the last several seconds of electric potential and then save that recording and start backwards. Okay, they start backwards from the time that the agent said, I was conscious at this time. I'll explain in a moment how it is the experiment was arranged so as to indicate actually what Libet did to record the actual time of the awareness of a conscious will. Let me, to that end, switch to another screen here and show you this one. Libet's experiments measured the, let's see if I got the right thing up here for myself. It is right here, and it needs to be over on this screen, so I'll cut to this one. That's good. You know, following the work of Kornhuber and Deecke, the great neurobiologist John Eccles had speculated, he kind of thought about this and argued in his book that the mind must be thinking about what to do before doing it. And there ought to be a period of time that could be discovered between the thought and the action. In my model, my free and then will gives us a time during which we're thinking about what we might do, the alternative possibilities. Then there comes a moment when you act, when you basically flick your wrist in the simple-minded Libet experiment. And that difference in time is something which Libet set about to measure. Now, the way he did it was he had an oscilloscope, an old-fashioned CRT. Long ago, we had these tubes which could put dots of light on a surface, like our original television sets were scanning dots across the screen. Anyway, Libet had this clock, and I see here I have a link to enlarge the clock. Let me see if I can bring it up here. Here it is filling the screen for us. Now this is an animation of Libet's clock, and it has a sort of interesting history. Dan Dennett, who is one of the important commentators on Libet's experiments and interpreters of the Libet experiments, along with Dan Wegner, that I mentioned here from Harvard with his book on the illusion of conscious will. Dan Dennett at Tufts basically used this experiment, and he used it in his classes to try to demonstrate what Libet had done. And Dan would stand up at the front of the class. He invited me to spend a semester as a member of his seminar on free will a few years ago. And Dan would stand up in front of the class, and he would say, "Now let me reproduce this experiment with you here." And he'd stand up and say, put his hand way up high, and he'd say, "Now I am going to wave my hand around in a big circle, and I want you to start to think about when you might want to flick your wrist. And just remember the moment on my hand going around at which you are aware of flicking your wrist." Well, these things really were not the sort of laboratory accurate things that Libet did, but he gave them a good idea. And I said to Dan, why don't I make you an animation of the dot going around the clock so that the students, when you present this, or he could use this in a lecture when he travels, he often lectures on this subject, which he has done since. I wrote him this, I created this animation for him where you can sort of decide now, and you can say, oh, I see the dot was down here around the 32, between 30 and 35, and that would allow more accurate experiments going forward in the future. So let's see if I can take this page back. Maybe I need to just go here or here. Here we are back with the animation that I built for Dan Dennett now here. And you can, of course, use this anytime. That link on the web is on my Information Philosopher website. And once again, I'm basically trying to introduce you to the mass of material and thoughts and diagrams and pictures and even animations that I'm producing for you to use in your own study, in your own learning about these great problems in philosophy, but here in the case of biology or psychology. Okay, so we're on a page called Benjamin Libet, and we are scrolling down to see a few other things here. Okay, I described Dan Wegner's work here a little bit below in his book, The Illusion of Conscious Will. And I point out on this page, another thinker on my website, Bernard Bars, says there are different time scales going on in the mind and in his theory of consciousness, which gives us some extra argument about what was going on with Benjamin Libet. Now, here's what I've tried to do. I've tried to compare a two-stage model of free will, which I came up with this in my own thinking about problems in philosophy in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And then, of course, later on, as I learned a great deal more and started writing up my work, I researched many, many others, something of the order of 24 thinkers who had independently, or in some cases they had earlier influences that they'd read and they remodeled it to their own terminology. But nevertheless, I have a web page called Two-Stage Models, in which I survey all of these thinkers. And I think that's an important thing to bring up on my site. So why don't I do that right here for a moment? Well, I could do it over here better. I'll show you what I'm doing by going to the Information Philosopher on this side. And I'll just pull down free will for a moment, go to the free will page, and scroll down. There's a huge, here are my different views on free will. But what I'm going to do is go down to the bottom of all these aspects of the free will problem, find the one called two-stage models, and then show you all of the thinkers that I've found who've given such a model. And now see if I can bring this up here like this. So two-stage models of free will. I've got William James at the head of it, and then some very great thinkers. Karl Popper is in there, Henri Poincaré, the great mathematician and physicist, Arthur Holly Compton, who's a quantum physicist who introduced the notion of quantum randomness. I think he was the first to bring it in as an idea that I now support. Robert Kane, of course, Dan Dennett, several others. And of all of them, I guess the last one turned out to be a very interesting one for me, and that's Martin Heisenberg, who's the son of Werner Heisenberg, whose work, of course, was my first indication that uncertainty, randomness, a kind of chance, was really involved in physics. And I thought, aha, with the work of Nature of the Physical World scientist, my mind is blocking me now at the moment. I read Arthur Stanley Eddington in the 1950s when I was at Brown. He decided that Heisenberg's uncertainty principle added a break of the deterministic idea, that if there were going to be events that were uncertain or statistical or chance only, Eddington argued, and he had just read Heisenberg when he was writing his book on Nature of the Physical World, he argued that opened a door, a kind of chink in the wall of determinism that might permit us to be free. That set me in motion, and it was maybe many years later that I began to write this up myself seriously and decided that the randomness must be involved in an early stage of thinking. And our will, our consideration of options, of possibilities, some of which may have arisen in our mind by popping into our mind by chance, that evaluation phase would be a kind of determined phase, in the sense not of predetermined from before we began thinking, which is what many, many philosophers make this foolish mistake, to say that the word determined and the word determinism must mean determined as in forever, predetermined, preordained by some power, omniscient power or whatever. Anyway, Martin Heisenberg is important because he led to my first philosophical publication back in 2009 or so. An article appeared in Nature in which Heisenberg showed that even very tiny cells, unicellular cells, for example, the bacteria, and even larger insects he studied, were showing signs of free optional possibilities for things that they do. And Nature published a wonderful article titled something like Free Will in biology or something. And I wrote a note to Nature and said that I thought the work Heisenberg had just done in Nature had been first done by William James. And they wrote my commentary about the position of Martin Heisenberg work relative to William James. That was the first publication of mine in philosophy, and Martin Heisenberg responded wonderfully and said how pleased he was to be associated with such a great thinker as William James. And then the two of us got to be invited in 2010 to a conference in Barcelona on Can Science Explain Free Will, or some such title. You'll find it on my website. And so I got to meet him, and he was very pleased with the two-stage model. And basically, I found in his writings the essence of that idea. So I've listed him as the last person thinker that I found that has had the idea of free will. And of course, he had it independently of William James and independently of the others. But if you go through my page on models of free will, there's lots on William James in particular, and then there's Henri Poincaré, Jacques Hadamard, who influenced Dan Dennett, then Arthur Holly Compton, who also influenced Dennett. I know Dennett was familiar with Popper, but I'm not absolutely sure that the last work of Popper, which is really wonderful on free will, was something that Dan Dennett had in mind in the late 70s. So here's Henry Margenau. Margenau is a great philosopher and physicist, and when I was at Brown, my senior year, I studied a great book called The Foundation of Physics, which was written by the lecturer, the chairman of the physics department at Brown University, named Bruce Lindsay, in cooperation with Henry Margenau. So I studied Lindsay and Margenau as a kind of more than only a physics book. It was called Foundations of Physics, and it had the philosophy of physics wonderfully laid out, and set me on, among my other philosophy courses that I took at Brown, onto a lifelong interest in philosophy. And then here's Dan Dennett, which is a very important one because Dan Dennett is very clear about the two-stage model. He actually writes it up more clearly than any other philosopher or scientist who's discussing this problem, that you need to separate the free part, okay, from the will part. That the free part, including indeterminism, has to be put in its place, and that place is at the beginning and not at the end of the decision process. Obviously, if it was the end and you just flipped a coin or introduced indeterminism to decide something, he would be doing something that's criticized by philosophers as not being responsible. because there was randomness involved. Now, both Dennett and my colleague Bob Kane have clearly shown why that is not necessarily true. You can read dozens of philosophers who've written on what's called the standard argument, I call the standard argument of free will, that if we're determined we're not free, and if at the end of our decision we flip a coin, that's random and we're not responsible. Now, Bob Kane has made it very clear that this is not the case. He describes being at the end of a decision and being torn between different alternatives. He describes a businesswoman who is on her way to a very important business meeting, and she passes someone in an alley who's obviously just been mugged, perhaps, by some criminal, and is lying there in a desperate state. And she has to decide between caring for something, going and calling help for this victim, or going on to her business meeting. So on the one hand, she's being altruistic and moral in Bob Kane's sense, and the other, she's just going for her prudential interests of following out her self-interest in business. And that's the kind of decision that Bob Kane says makes a self-forming action creates the character of that woman if she stays there as opposed to going off into her own self-interest mode. Now, I think that's a mistake in trying to connect our free decisions with our moral responsibility. We've discussed that in a past lecture, and it's on my webpage on separability of free from will. But Dan Dennett also, in this book called Brainstorms, this 1978 book, he comes up with a case of a woman who's trying to decide whether to go to University of California or Harvard, maybe, Cornell, and she more or less can't decide when it comes down to it. She looks at the departments, the options, and so forth, and at the end of the day, she just decides she has to flip a coin. But Dan does accurately show that that in no way makes her morally incompetent or lacking in the responsibility for her choice between two things, each of which would be fine for her education. And so in that regard, Dennett and Kane, both prominent thinkers in this whole issue of free will, have both sort of seen that there are these two parts to the decision, which is what we're discussing here in the work of Benjamin Libet, because he's shown that there's something going on, and it's just an electrical potential coming up before the decision is made later. And Dennett and Bob Kane are both thinking that there is some randomness involved. Now, I want the randomness to be at the beginning of things. Bob Kane tends to think it's important at the end, and Dan Dennett also wants to insist that the randomness in our mind is not necessarily deep quantum ontological chance, the kind that Heisenberg wrote about, and I thought that was the origin of the story back in the 70s and the 60s. But I have now shown that 10 years before Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Albert Einstein had discovered ontological chance as a component, a foundational component of statistical quantum mechanics. We'll do a lot of work on that in the future. But coming back to Libet, we now have this timing problem. And if the timing starts with thinking up alternative possibilities and then later choosing between them, we can kind of see more clearly what it is that Benjamin Libet's experiment is doing. Now, I want to say one more thing. I've got here a screen comparing a two-stage model, which I have described as leaving the fixed past behind. And what we have to have here is no causal effects coming through into our decision process which determine that decision. So the argument is something has to happen in here that was not caused by prior events, but involved a creative act or a random event which did not depend in any way, was not caused by anything prior. And I divided into a period of time during which we're generating alternative possibilities and then going over to an evaluation process in which all the possibilities are now being compared to our motives, our feelings, our values, in short, our character. Whatever it is that is our method of judging which of these alternative possibilities would work best for us goes on in a certain period of time. Now, resolving this, we certainly then come to our decision and go on off into the future. So the argument of Libet that we have a time, which he called W, the time in which we know that we are aware of having made a decision. That would be what Dan Wegner is saying, the conscious will, the conscious recognition that we are aware of having made a decision. That would be what Libet called this moment here, and he has this curve going up and down. So after which we're fully aware of having made the decision. And I just want to argue that this rise of what he called his readiness potential, or what Kornhuber and Deecke called the readiness potential, or the Bereitschaftspotential in German, is clearly doing something back before our decision. And to me, that's pretty much an adequate argument for saying that something's going on in the mind, or the brain, as they talked about it, and those are, that's a time in which we're considering alternative possibilities. So some more particulars, perhaps, that I have the work of Alfred Mealy here, which you could see on my Libet page. I'll bring up his name so you can see it clearly. And he's criticized this interpretation, that this is somehow going to make us determined, because he worried about the quality of the evidence in the Libet experiment. Now, Al Mealy was another one of the philosophers who was invited to this free will experts meeting, it was called, in Barcelona. And Al gave a presentation in which he pointed out that the way Libet's experiment works is that the subject who's doing the test about trying randomly to just suddenly think of flicking the wrist and then trying to notice when the wrist was flicked and compare that to the consciousness, that whole process, he pointed out, Al Mealy pointed out, only recorded or saved and then reported the earlier events, okay, back in this time period here, if you flicked your wrist. And so he said, what about those times, Mealy said, what about those times when you didn't flick your wrist, but you may have thought about flicking your wrist, and there might have been a rise in the readiness potential, but then when the time comes, you didn't flick your wrist. Mealy said, the experiments have left those out of the work. So how is that establishing a kind of causal relationship with the earlier activity and the later action, the earlier electric potential rising and the later motion of the wrist? And that's a wonderful question. Anyone who selectively eliminates certain other evidence because of the way in which the experiment depends on a wrist having been flicked has made a serious error. And in particular, what we're going to argue, what I would like to argue, is that if we have alternative possibilities, they might include then flicking the wrist or not flicking the wrist. And you might come to a point where you think about not flicking the wrist, or you think about it but then don't do it. What Libet called a veto. You decide to do something, or you're thinking about doing something, and then you decide not to do it. In fact, Libet had pointed out we have plenty of time between anything happening earlier, and we may even be on the way to deciding to flick the wrist, but there's plenty of time to veto that decision. I accept Al Mealy's criticisms, and it's a reach when someone like Dan Wegner or Dan Dennett goes on to show that this thing earlier than our conscious will has determined our result. It's not at all clear, because we might have had a rise in the potential and no conscious decision was made to flick the wrist. Let me say that a different way. It's only a kind of determinist who thinks that anything that happens before the event, anything before the event, is the cause of the event. This is the famous Latin phrase, post hoc propter hoc. Since this decision is after the earlier thing, it must be because of the earlier thing. But I hope I've made it clear to you that what Libet's experiments left out, but now change the interpretation or the understanding of the whole process of a free will, is that there might have been similar things which I think of as thinking processes, which are not yet leading to actions, which are not in any way the cause of the action. They are just the prelude. They are just the period of time during which we're thinking about what we might do. And clearly, most of the examples of things where we think seriously and have plenty of time to think before we act consciously, we do consider many alternatives. This Libet's experiment then is a kind of a forced example of being pressed into doing something instantly and randomly so as to try to establish something which I don't think has much application to the general problem of whether we are free to deliberate, free to create, free to come up with alternative possibilities and then act on one of them. So if we go down a little bit more on our page, I introduce you to the work of Van Wegner and Patrick Haggard and others and what they show. And I have a section on the relationship between determinism and free will that Libet wrote about. He wrote rather well about this. And then I want to introduce one other thinker who I believe I've included in my list of those who has come up with a model of free will, and that's someone named Stephen Kosslyn. Let me bring that up to the full screen for a moment. Steve Kosslyn was at Harvard for a long time, really well respected, and he got a tremendous offer to go off to Stanford, I believe, and head up another very big program out there. Maybe I can just touch this screen here for a moment and see if I can open this in a new tab. And where would that be? Here we go. I'm trying to remind myself of Stephen's work. He's no longer a Harvard psychologist. I should update my page. But his specialty is mental imagery. And let me go back to this one and see if I've got this one happening here. Right. Kosslyn had wonderful books about where in the brain were the images. It was really interesting to me because, as you know, I'm trying to think about our mind as having in it information storage. And so Kosslyn's work was, where is it? Is there something in the mind that's sort of isomorphic, a kind of a mapping of the thing we're thinking about? In the case of Charles Peirce always says that language is either iconic or indexical or symbolic and purely abstract. So if it's an abstract thought, there's probably nothing in the brain that looks anything like an idea, a general idea, and the word connecting to the word we give it, because it's totally arbitrary. But if it's iconic and we're thinking of a house with a certain shape, well, houses might have lots of different shapes, stop signs. Is there something in the mind that is something like a stop sign? That was the work of Stephen Kosslyn. Anyway, Stephen got invited to write a foreword, and what I want to do for that is just go back to his book for a moment, the Mind Time book by Benjamin Libet. And in the book, Kosslyn wrote a foreword. He starts off very much in the vein of my work with you today. He says, I just typed the word consciousness into the search engine in Amazon. Well, today we'd use Google, and it returned 2,670 titles. Anyway, Benjamin Libet, he goes on to describe, has this model. And he tries to describe it really well by saying he doesn't want to think that it's random entirely. And he writes up, I then excerpted from this foreword to Benjamin Libet's book, his thoughts. He's saying he thinks everyone seems to describe the conscious decisions as determined. Kosslyn looked at Dan Wegner's work, and I've shown you his work, Illusion of Conscious Will. Then he says, the idea that's being determined is not necessarily random. And you remember we have the two sides of the standard argument, determined or random. And you need to read this, I'm afraid it's rather long, to go through Kosslyn's arguments. But here he considers a first stage, or a free creation of alternative courses of action. And then he talks about, given all those choices and the anticipated consequence that we consider, he now considers a second stage. And we note that he says here, it constructs alternatives. We construct alternatives, rationales, and anticipate the consequences. So he nicely writes, what one is governs how one actually makes the decision. And making that decision and experiencing the actual consequences in turn modifies what one is. This sounds like Bob Kane. The character is being formed every time we make a decision, especially when it's an important decision. For Kane, it wants to be a moral decision. I don't think that's necessary, because as we learn about the world through what I call our experience recorder and reproducer, we have experiences, and when they turn out well, that's undoubtedly reinforcing, perhaps then encouraging us to take the same choice or alternative in the future. When it turns out badly, we probably calibrate, think twice next time, because our experience reproducer, when we get into a certain situation that resembles past experiences, our brain is flooded at the unconscious level, perhaps, as William James would have argued, with a lot of these past experiences that are relevant to what we might decide to do next. That Kosslyn describes as our process of thinking. So he argues that Libet has come up with free will, a model, and I like that very much. Now, let's go back to the Benjamin Libet page for just a moment, because I thought I had put in this page, lots here to read, some reference to the work of Kornhuber and Deecke. Mind you, and here they are. So Kornhuber and Deecke had done their work 15 years or so or more before the work of Libet. And I recently heard from Lueder Deecke because he discovered my page on Libet. And he wrote me a very nice note, and we've been exchanging a couple of notes about his work and how happy he is to be to find my account of his work and Libet's work. But let's just go and take a look at my Kornhuber and Deecke page, because I'd like to show you something that, let's see if I can bring this to full screen, and we'll talk about this for just a minute. So they discovered this small electric potential of just a few microvolts and called it the Bereitschaft's potential. And they created this BR-RP diagram as it's described. I mentioned to you earlier that John Eccles had speculated that this might be a sign that you're not conscious of something that's happening because you first have to develop the intention to do it. And then here's the story of Libet. And so we write about what Libet had done and noticed, Deecke noticed that in my page on Libet, I had added a sentence that said, let's see if I can find it over here. No, I can't. That there is a, besides the one that's around 300, 400, 500 milliseconds, there's another one which might be as early as 1.5 milliseconds. If I got that, seconds, I'm sorry, 1.5 seconds, 1500 milliseconds. And there's been studies that show there are other activity that are correlated with our doing something several seconds before that action. Okay? Now, all of that work being done recently, and there are large numbers of people doing experiments with just the electric potential. One would think they would have moved on to MRIs and other methods, magnetic imaging things that would allow you to see a lot more going on and relate it to something that we're going to do. And I'm sure there'll be more of that in neuroscience. This is an exciting area because it gets a lot of publicity. But the early 1.5 seconds, I got a note from Deecke who said the following. Let me bring it up on the full screen. When you are saying, quote, indeed an early or slow and very slight rise in the readiness potential can be seen as early as 1.5 seconds, this is indeed so. This is the BP1, the Bereitschaft potential 1. And he goes into a lot of technical discussions, which I'll leave for you. And he goes on to say why this is so important, so early, and so necessary. And he postulated that there has to be another area involved with the cingulate part of the brain, as opposed to the so-called supplementary motor areas. And he sends me this marvelous diagram of the brain in which everything's in German. He apologizes. He doesn't have an English version of this thing, and he overwrites the area he thought he saw these early rise in potential. And he found that today, he and Kornhuber had found this other area right up against the cingulate, which is a long band of material that surrounds this open space inside the brain. And it's in the cingulate area where the so-called corpus callosum, where there are connections between the left and right hemispheres of the brain. At any rate, today we're not going to go into so much of that brain science, although in future lectures I hope to do some of that with you. The main thing is that he writes to me that we're getting the story correct, and he said he was pleased with my webpage on Libet with a brief mention of his work. So I also now have a page on his work and his 2009 book called The Will in the Brain. And I've provided the preface to that book, which does a couple of important things. First of all, Deecke and Kornhuber apparently as well were completely convinced that the work they were doing was in no way supporting the idea that they saw around in the literature that the will is completely determined, that the brain is determined because we're physical objects subject to physical laws, and therefore everything that was happening to us. It wasn't something we were making happen. And I'm very pleased to find that in this book, The Will and Its Brain, that's up on Amazon. I have a link there to it. And towards the end, he mentions a few other important insights. Let's see if I can go to here for a moment and bring up, I'm going to show you what I'm doing. I'm looking at this page and I'm going down and I'm trying to find, I've got a lot of philosophers to go through and then scientists, and we can finally probably find under the D here somewhere Oh, maybe I have to refresh this page. And look again. There we are. So here's the book, the page on we've just been discussing, and I'm looking at the book called The Will in Its Brain. And down here, it's nice to see that he describes the tradition in the United States. All right, I'll expand that just a little bit. There's a movement against total determinism, which is what he's trying to do. And he cites a writer named Edward Deecke, I hope that's the way he pronounces it. It might be Deecke if it's Italian. And this Deecke or whatever, and a colleague named Robert Ryan have been writing books about self-determination. Now here, Deecke and Kornhuber are saying self-determinism, self-regulation, and even self-management. So there is a very strong subject today in psychotherapy called self-determination, or the equivalent. And there's a major textbook by Deecke and Ryan, which I've just ordered to try to get an insight into this, because Luder Deecke is telling us that there's a group of people thinking that the determinism is not the case, that we do have the ability to self-manage, to self-determine. There is self-determination. I have an important webpage on that. And they apparently are citing the work of William James, which that's the sort of thing I like to discover. And so after I've read this book, I may add a little work on this area going on over in psychology, particularly psychotherapy, trying to encourage people to understand that they are in charge, as opposed to the books we looked at recently, Who's in Charge, that the neuroscientists who are confident that everything that's going on is just our neurons doing something and giving us the illusion that we are doing that something. Another note on what we're going to do in the future on psychology. You know that I'm working on my fourth book on Albert Einstein and all his discoveries of chance and his attempts to explain the mysteries of quantum mechanics. That I'm really looking forward to that being the major part of my work in the next several months. But after that, my fifth book will be in my scandal series, like Free Will, the Scandal in Philosophy, where professors are teaching students that they are determined, and that's such a serious mistake. It denies them creativity, which is, again, an immoral position as far as I'm concerned. They should not be doing such things. They could perhaps bring them up as a philosophical possibility position, but I wish they would also strongly present the model that someone as important as Benjamin Libet and these great neurophysiologists, Deecke and Kornhuber, who believe that what they're seeing in the brain, and I would think it's going on in the mind because that's where the thinking is going on, all this information recovery, reproduction by the experience recorder, leads us to see a mind as information managing itself, just as it's information processing that manages us all the way down to our cells managing themselves and the tiny little molecular machines inside the cells that are keeping us alive. It's all about information being in charge of our material. And as our material selves, our parts break, need to be repaired. Sometimes they repair themselves. So our cells die and they reproduce and we have more of them and we can go on. Cells may only have a lifetime of a few minutes, and yet we have a lifetime of many years, 81 in my case. So at the end of this preface that I've reproduced of Luder Deecke's book, I see that he says there's this tradition, and he says that these people are reviving the tradition of William James, and that's very encouraging. He then cites Karl Popper's work, which Popper for many years fought against these ideas, and it was only in his later years that he gave an article, an explanation which I see makes him a fully someone who is proposing a two-stage model of free will. I've got Margano, here we are, Karl Popper. Let me just switch quickly to that one for a moment. Here's my argument. It turns out it was his, he first talked about it in 1965 in his Arthur Holly Compton lecture. I cite Compton as one of the early thinkers about free will. But I know also noticed that in those days he was sort of interested in the problem, but he came around, wrote a book in 1977 with John Eccles, who we cited was the inspiration for the work of Benjamin Libet, because Eccles was the one who said, there may be a time in our, here's his book, The Self and Its Brain, there may be a time when we are considering what to do and we're not aware of consciously choosing one of those until later. But the major talk that Popper presented, the two-stage model, was in what he called a Darwin lecture at Darwin College in Cambridge. So let me come back to this work of Deecke, and we'll just notice that he also cites, in particular he cites Bob Kane, who talked about the Bereitschaft potential in Kane's Oxford Handbook of Free Will. That was the 2002 version, as you see here. Let me just make sure I've got this up on the screen. I guess it's also here. And then he cites Daniel Dennett. Now, it's fine that he cites Daniel Dennett, because one of the things that Dennett did, which is quite valuable, I'm sure, to the German Deecke, is that Dan wrote the foreword for this wonderful book by Kornhuber and Deecke. Now, there's some serious irony there. And it's ironic because Dan Dennett is definitely a determinist, a compatibilist, who does not see the kind of free will that both Libet saw, according to our friend Stephen Kosslyn, nor that I now know from the book we were just discussing by Kornhuber and Deecke, it was not what they thought. So I'm not sure that Lueder Deecke appreciates Dennett's position, because he describes it here. In the United States, it is in particular, let's see if I can pick out these lines for you. In the United States, it is in particular the philosopher Daniel Dennett who is writing important books and is an eminent promoter of will evolving in freedom. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case. I believe that Dan Dennett's view is a very subtle view, consistent with his notion that the brain and mind are a kind of computer-like system. Perhaps it's a metaphor, perhaps he really thinks of it as logic gates. He did in early years of computers, and that the randomness involved in generating alternative possibilities, which Dan took from the work of Herbert Simon and Alan Newell in their so-called general problem solver, that's enough in that model to have the alternative possibilities, which are so critical to my thinking, be randomly generated by a random number generator, a so-called pseudo-random number generator that computers can generate. Well, I worked on that problem back in the 60s when I used Harvard's super biggest IBM computer at the time to work out my thesis. And it just wasn't the case that pseudo-random numbers were as random as we could have in the universe, because we've got quantum randomness. With quantum randomness, nothing that we generate from that randomness will give us, quantum randomness will provide a true deep randomness, which will make us original, creative in all of our works. Okay, I think our time is running out on this, but I'm happy that one of our commentators brought up this subject and I was able to deal with it today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. It will be a Friday, and we'll get back to Albert Einstein. I'm hard at work. I'm trying to explain his probability waves. It's very exciting, very interesting. I hope you're going to like where we're going with this. And I guess I should sign off here. I've lost my frame temporarily that just puts up